In 1924, the French writer André Breton drafted the first Surrealist manifesto, Le Manifeste du Surrealisme. In the manifesto, he defines Surrealism as
psychic automatism in its pure state, by which one proposes to express verbally, by means of the written word, or in any other manner the actual functioning of thought. Dictated by the thought, in the absence of any control exercised by reason, exempt from any aesthetic or moral concern.
Much of the document concerns itself with the nature of dreams and dreaming. It is heavily influenced by Freud, whose interpretation of dreams, first published in 1911, was still causing shockwaves. Freud begins the interpretation of dreams by saying,
"In the following pages, I shall demonstrate that there is a psychological technique which makes it possible to interpret dreams, and that on the application of this technique, every dream will reveal itself as a psychological structure, full of significance, and one which may be assigned to a specific place in the psychic activities of the waking state."
In common with Freud, the Surrealists placed the subconscious on a pedestal and examined it from a scientific perspective. They believed the apparent irrationality of our inner minds could tell us much about the human psyche and unveil a reality which our conscious minds filter out. Like Dada, its immediate predecessor, Surrealism was not to be confined to the art gallery. In fact, it had started out as a literary movement before being seized upon by such artists as Max Ernst and Man Ray. Of all the media available to be used in exploring the subconscious, the relatively new medium of the cinema offered most potential, untarnished as it was by centuries of tradition. Even before the Surrealists began to experiment with film, filmmakers were using it to create representations of the fantastic. Obvious examples are any number of films by George Méliès, most famously A Trip to the Moon, Cecil Hepworth's Alice in Wonderland, and Larry Seaman's Wizard of Oz. The interaction between Surrealism and the cinema has been rich and varied. It involved, initially, a small group of films produced within the framework of the French Surrealist movement of the 1920s, among which Un Chien Andalou, 1929.
stands as a brief, comic, terrifying landmark.
Hollywood comedians such as Harold Lloyd and Buster Keaton were apt to exploit the malleability of reality on celluloid for comic effect. In fact, it can be argued that Surrealism brought little if anything new to the world of cinema, at least in terms of technique. The debt owed by Surrealism to earlier cinema was acknowledged in the 1950s when scholars began looking seriously at the history of film. According to Rudolf Kinsley, these historians
also began to formulate a canon of the Surrealist and the Surrealistic film, at the center of which were Un Chien Andalou and Large Door. These two films were viewed as the crowning achievement of a pure surrealism that could now be seen to stretch back through the more grotesque moments of von Stroheim, the more dreamlike passages of Keaton, Chaplin and Feuillade, and finally, back to the original surrealist essence of cinema in Méliès. At the periphery of this canon were the many films with occasional moments of accidental or involuntary surrealism.
Un Chien Andalou and Large Door are both the work of Luis Buñuel and his fellow Spaniard Salvador Dalí. At the time that they decided to collaborate, Buñuel was a minor poet, an assistant director to Jean Epstein and a recent recruit to the Paris Surrealist group. Dalí had yet to make any impact on the world of art. Their first film, Un Chien Andalou, is a 16-minute smorgasbord of bizarre scenarios that collectively tell a story that, on the surface at least, makes no sense. It is a negation of rationality. The title, for instance, has little if anything to do with the film. It is in fact the title of a collection of Buñuel's poetry. Although both Buñuel and Dalí have over the years been less than consistent in their accounts of how the film came about, they both agreed that while staying with Dalí at his house, Buñuel told him about a dream he had in which a cloud sliced the moon in half.
Like a razor blade slicing through an eye.
Dalí then recounted a disturbing dream of his own, and the pair agreed to create a low-budget film constructed from irrational images dredged from their subconscious minds. How much each of the collaborators contributed to the film will remain a matter of debate for years to come. According to the notes that accompany the BFI's box set edition of Un Chien Andalou,
Dolly's claim that he presented Buñuel with a complete alternative scenario, scribbled in a quarter of an hour on a shoebox, does not match Buñuel's memory of the scenario's construction morning by morning at Figueres from shared memories of dream residues and spontaneously invoked gags and objects, a concoction resolutely shorn of conscious meanings and associations.
The film opens with a sequence based on Buñuel's dream snippet. A man, played by Buñuel himself, is seen sharpening a cutthroat razor. He walks onto a balcony and observes a sliver of cloud racing across the sky towards the moon. We immediately cut to a close-up of a woman's face. The woman is passive as a hand holds one of her eyes open and the razor is brought towards it. The cloud slices the moon, the razor slices the eye. Closer examination shows that the eye being sliced is that of an animal, presumably one of the dead donkeys seen later in the film. Straight away, an intertitle comes up. It reads, "Wheat on Opry, 8 years later." There follows a scene of a man dressed as a nun on a bicycle. This dissolves to a shot of a woman in an apartment reading a book. It is the woman we saw being mutilated. As if by some miracle, her eye is intact. The events of the opening scene are never referred to, never explained. According to Buñuel,
the plot is the result of a conscious psychic automatism, and, to that extent, it does not attempt to recount a dream, although it profits by a mechanism analogous to that of dreams.
He goes on to say that he and Dolly both took their point of view from a dream image, which, in its turn, probed others by the same process until the whole took form as a continuity. Although the influence of Un Chien Andalou on Maya Deren's Meshes of the Afternoon is undeniable, the two films are far apart in tone. The difference between the films is instructive. Un Chien Andalou is filled with metaphors, the eye and the moon, a drink shaker as a doorbell, the sea urchin and underarm hair, but Meshes has none. Objects in the earlier film recur, but without the symbolic dimensions of the knife, key, and flower in Meshes, which accumulate their deadly charge through repeated use in slightly different circumstances. Unlike Un Chien Andalou, the plot of Meshes is fairly straightforward and comprehensible. Ken Danziger sums it up in one paragraph. He says it
explores the story of a young woman. She is being followed to an apartment where she is to meet a man. The key to the apartment, a knife inside the apartment, and the bed are the important artifacts. The woman who is following her, and the man are the only characters. The woman who follows her is hooded and has a mirror over her face. Whether she is a reflection or the woman's conscience, is subject to interpretation. By the end of the story the woman is dead in the apartment. Was it a crime of passion, a suicide, or the emotional, inevitable consequence of her own passion?
The main factor that distinguishes the two films is the intent of the makers. Un Chien Andalou strives to be shocking and provocative, a call to murder as Buñuel famously put it. Dolly and Buñuel do their best to obscure its meaning. In fact, they go out of their way to eradicate any meaning it might have. Meshes, on the other hand, is a search for meaning, a psycho quest wherein its protagonist reaches some kind of self-understanding. Which is not to say that Meshes is not disturbing, it's just that its madness is that of the paranoid introvert rather than the raving lunatic tormented by sexual guilt and visions of corporeal corruption. It has been hailed in retrospect as the first trans film, a subgenre first identified by the American film historian P. Adam Sidney and defined as a type of expressionistic film in which a character, frequently the filmmaker, experiences a personal revelation by playing out a psychological drama in dream-like surroundings. According to James Peterson,
the trans film was concerned with the psyche of its protagonist, but its first-person aspects, shots from the protagonist's point of view, were qualified and mediated by the entrance of the protagonist as a character in the film.
Deren uses a number of camera tricks to illustrate the state of mind of her protagonist, played by Deren and no doubt meant to represent Deren. In order to suggest the degree of diffusion, Maya Deren uses unsettling camera angles and motion. The camera turns not horizontally but on a U-axis in order to simulate the woman's feelings of diffusion. The extreme close-ups of the woman removing the key from her mouth suggest the clandestine implications of the key, as well as the key's sexual subtext. Deren also highlights the violent and sexual character of the knife in the same visually powerful manner. Her use of jump cuts convey the heightened emotional state of the woman. Although the images of flowers and the seashore imply a romantic dimension of the tryst, the overwhelming number of close-ups of the woman heighten the sexual violent atmosphere in the apartment and the man-woman interface. The tragic ending confirms the primacy of identity diffusion. Most of the above effects can be achieved in other media but only as discrete entities. It is possible, for instance, to reconstruct meshes as a series of still photographs, but that would lack the fluidity of the moving image. Dreams are not made up of frozen instances. They are profoundly cinematic. If we could capture dreams and play them back, they would resemble Unchien Andlu or meshes of the afternoon rather more than any number of Man Ray photographs or Salvador Dali painted dreamscapes. Meshes is designed to be analyzed and penetrated. It offers us an insight into the mind of Maya Deren as she acts out her inner concerns and anxieties. Unchien Andlu, by contrast, is out to shock and unsettle. It is an assemblage of vaguely related scenes with which we are invited to construct a meaningful narrative. Buñuel and Dali's next film Large Door is closer to meshes and mainstream cinema in that it sets out to tell a story, albeit one that plays fast and loose with reality. Regardless of the question of influence, it is true that the mechanics of Unchien Andlu and of meshes result from a theoretical application of the principles of cinema to the experience of the dream. Buñuel's straightforward style serves to heighten haunting images that disturb received notions of religion and sexuality. Buñuel's modernism emerges as well in his experiments with narrative construction. The films are full of repetitions, digressions, and movements between reality and fantasy.
"Don't worry if the movie's too short,"
he once told a producer.
"I'll just put in a dream."
Most modernists attack narrative in order to turn the viewer's attention to other matters, but Buñuel treats narrative frustration as itself the basis of pleasure. Buñuel contextualizes Unchien Andlu by means of concepts such as automaticity, the unconscious, the poetic, the spectator, and the avant-garde. The automaticity of the film's creation, for Buñuel, cancels rational, aesthetic, and ethical considerations, together with those of customary morality, and points to the fact that Unchien Andlu does not recount a dream but
profits by a mechanism analogous to dreams.
The nature of this mechanism is unclear, but the aesthetic consequence is that the film is able to draw upon putatively liberated psychic impulses, formally deployed as poetic constructs, rather than as intended symbols. In spite of its commitment to the work of the unconscious, the film in fact has quite deliberate intentions. With familiar surrealist idealism, Buñuel confers upon the film a strongly conscious sense of purpose when he argues that it makes systematic use of the poetic image as an arm to overthrow accepted notions. And although its makers reject intended symbols, the scenario itself explicitly demands the clear and symbolic placement of objects on the school desk in the scene with the male protagonist's double, a demand which the film itself does not fulfill with any clarity. What Dali and Buñuel achieved through this method of compiling a scenario was the liberation of their material from the demands of narrative continuity. Far from being puzzling, the film achieves the clarity of a dream. The extremity of the violence and the calculated abruptness of changes of time, place, and mood intensify the viewing experience without satisfying the conventional narrative demands of cause and effect. The strength of the identification in the context of the abrupt dislocations and discontinuities provides us with a vivid metaphor for the dream experience. Had Dali and Buñuel set about to study their own dreams and clinically recreate a dream on film, they could not have surpassed Unchien Andlu.
This film is concerned with the interior experiences of an individual. It does not record an event which could be witnessed by other persons. Rather, it reproduces the way in which the subconscious of an individual will develop, interpret, and elaborate an apparently simple and causal incident into a critical emotional experience.
In Meshes of the Afternoon, the heroine undertakes an interior quest. She encounters objects and sights as if they were capable of revealing the erotic mystery of the self. The surrealistic cinema, on the other hand, depends upon the power of film to evoke a mad voyeurism and to imitate the very discontinuity, the horror, and the irrationality of the unconscious. Meshes explicitly simulates the dream experience, first in the transition from waking to sleeping, the shadow covers the eye and the window at the end of the first cycle, and later in an ambiguous scene of waking. The filmmakers have observed with accuracy the way in which the events and objects of the day become potent, then transfigured, in dream, as well as the way in which a dreamer may realize that he dreams and may dream that he wakes. They have telescoped the experience of an obsessive, recurrent series of dreams into a single one by substituting variations on the original dream for what would conventionally be complete transitions of subject within a single dream. Maya Deren's beliefs about the proper relations between the photographic and film media oppose those of the advocates of phenomenological cinema. Like most of those who flourished in the period of early American modernism, Deren believed that each medium has its own unique properties which artists must exploit. Deren claimed that the properties of film derived from the camera and that the impartiality and clarity of the lens, its precise fidelity to the aspect and texture of physical matter, is the first contribution of the camera. Despite his general reference to dream symbols, Buñuel does not seem to limit the potential range of dream mechanisms to the one Freud calls the symbolic. In fact, he and Dali surely used several different mechanisms as models. It seems certain in any case that the two Spaniards were fascinated by the mechanism Freud himself called the most psychologically interesting achievement of the dream work, namely the translation of a latent verbal thought into manifest visual images. According to Freud, the dream work must reformulate scandalous or morally repugnant thoughts in order to allow them to be represented in the dream. This reformulation can proceed in several ways. For example, words can be found whose concreteness or, alternatively, ambiguity, enable them to slip past the censorship and serve as the basis for both the odd and innocuous dream images. This is the primary mechanism used by verbal disguised dreams. The important point to note here is that the form of, if not the motive for, this kind of operation on language readily lends itself for conscious use in the making of a film. If Dali and Buñuel
were intrigued by the possibilities opened up by such an adaptation, and that is my claim, then one might expect to find instances in Unchen and Lu in which gestures, images, or indeed entire sequences were created by finding visual forms for verbal expressions.